Hello and welcome to another episode of Acting Prime Minister with me, Paul Brand, the podcast where we pick the PM and ask a different guest each week to imagine themselves behind that Downing Street door. And as our current Premier faces unprecedented pressure to deal with the coronavirus, the pandemic is forcing us all to change the way we do things. This week's guest comes to us live from Selfisolation, where he's been experiencing symptoms of the virus himself. He's only just been elected chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, a rather dry name for what will be a colourful committee, looking at everything from the way Dominic Cummings runs Downing Street to when and how we should hold elections. But right now, his focus, like the government, is on beating this virus, if indeed he has it. Will Wragg, welcome to Acting Prime Minister.
Hello, Paul. Thank you for having me.
And first of all, how are you feeling?
Oh, I felt better, put it that way. I think it's fairly mild symptoms, so I'm very keen to follow the advice, as everybody should do. And so on Thursday, when I had started with these symptoms, I took the decision to self-isolate, and here I remain.
Yeah, you're in your flat, aren't you, in self-isolation, where you've been for 5 days. So what were the symptoms that you had that led you to think that it was necessary to stay indoors?
Well, I developed a cough on Thursday afternoon, together with a slight temperature, and those obviously telltale signs apparently. And then particularly as the weekend wore on, felt a bit more unwell. Won't alarm you with all the details, but they're not that hard to imagine. But no, I think the worst aspects are sometimes the night sweats aren't particularly pleasant, but that's what you get with a virus, I suppose.
Yeah, indeed. And how have you been keeping yourself ticking over? Because it must be quite sort of difficult being on your own for all that time.
I've never been afraid of my own company, fortunately, and plenty of box sets to catch up on. Finally got around to watching the third series of The Crown, almost in a binge, and then books, but also just keeping up with emails, and making sure my staff are okay and that we're doing the best we can for constituents who are getting in touch at the moment, understandably concerned.
And some people are going to be asked to self-isolate for 14 days in some cases, maybe even 12 weeks. How do you think people are going to sort of cope with that, having been through a little bit of it yourself? Mentally, it's a challenge. We're fundamentally social people, and I think we'll find it quite difficult. I think particularly for those who are going to be required to do it for a longer length of time than a week. You mentioned also a fortnight. A fortnight will be a struggle in itself, I imagine, for a lot of people. But my main concern is, as you say, for those who may be asked to do it for 12 weeks or so, of their elderly or vulnerable people with pre-existing conditions. And I think we have to look at how we do things completely different. And actually, me being able to do this with you today is a new departure for me, is a new departure for you, but actually it's quite welcome to have a degree of contact with the outside world in a way. And so we'll be needing to find ways how we can do that with those groups who have got to sort of isolate for upwards of 12 weeks. I'm glad that we're helping to keep you going while you're in self-isolation.
Absolutely.
And look, now that you've got the time to dream, we will talk about lots of serious things on this podcast, but let's ask you the regular questions that we ask all our guests too, because we don't want you to miss out.
Sure.
So let's get you settled into Downing Street as Prime Minister for the next few minutes or so. And firstly, when you settle into that Downing Street study, what is the picture you think you'd hang on the wall?
The picture I'd hang on the wall in the study would probably be the Duke of Wellington.
Right.
I'd probably have the Duke. I know it's probably I'm living up now to the title of my committee, aren't I? I'm sounding rather dry, but I would have the Duke of Wellington, because he had a phrase because he was briefly Prime Minister. He didn't enjoy being Prime Minister particularly. He thought that his cabinet should do as his officers did at Waterloo and so forth. And so he didn't have a particularly good time of it. But he said that politics was about being able to see what was on the other side of the hill. And he had that sort of battle analogy to it. And I think he was spot on. Politics is about being able to see what's on the other side of the hill. And as current events show, that's not always a particularly easy thing to do.
No. And what's the first drink you'd pour yourself, do you think, as you settled in?
Oh, I'd probably a whiskey and dry.
that's got particularly medicinal purposes at the moment, you'll understand.
I'm not sure that's in the Public Health England guidance, but...
Well, I don't want to, people must follow the guidance, but if they like a drink of choice when you're not feeling particularly well, whiskey and dry goes down a treat.
Okay, and who's the first person you'd call?
I'd probably call my mum and just, let her know that I'd settled in.
Okay.
She's a regular correspondent at the moment, as you understand.
All of our parents are, aren't they? It's a worrying time for anyone with elderly relatives. Right, of course, as Prime Minister, you could appoint anyone to your cabinet too. Who from history would you love to have in there, do you think?
Well, I'd probably appoint former Prime Ministers for two reasons. First of all, their experience and their insight, because I imagine being Prime Minister is a very lonely job to be doing. I also think you have to be slightly abnormal to want to be Prime Minister in the first place, but that goes by the by. And so I'd probably have former Prime Ministers. And they'd also come with the added benefit that they wouldn't want to take your job from you because they've already had that job. And so I know Prime Ministers appoint cabinets of people who they don't see any great challenges within it. And certainly you wouldn't get that from former Prime Ministers, would you?
Yeah, nobody's sort of stabbing you in the back.
I don't think I could quite go to Churchill's levels. But I think I'd probably look going sweeping through history at the likes of Disraeli and others such as him. I know I'm playing up to this old fusty image that you created with the title of my committee. But
I should mention that you're only about 32, aren't you, Will?
Well, I was very kindly in one of the more kinder comments actually recently in the press described as a young fogey, which I took as a badge of. But the question is how much of that is how much put that on it is a front rather than anything else.
Okay, look, and as Prime Minister, of course, you're going to have some pressing issues on your desk. I mean, most importantly, you're going to be thrown straight into this coronavirus crisis. And the government has now announced new social distancing measures, and probably by the time people listen to this podcast, the advice will have been updated again. So we don't want to give out any misleading information. So let's not go into too much detail about what the advice is at this exact point.
Yeah.
But do you think that maybe the government should have taken some of these steps a little bit earlier?
Well, no, I don't, because at the end of the day, these are unprecedented times, and a government and a Prime Minister will be criticised regardless of what steps they take. I think that the approach the government on the whole have taken now is the correct approach. But, we do live in as the Prime Minister said, a very well-established liberal democracy. It depends how much of people's liberty they wish to have curtailed rather than being able to make the judgment themselves. We're not in China. We're not governed by an authoritarian Politburo. The government doesn't automatically consider shutting down entire areas and draconian measures like that. But what that requires in a well-established liberal democracy is the cooperation of people. And I think that people have shown, by and large, that they are in that cooperative spirit, and that's crucial as we go forward.
It is difficult, though, isn't it, as you say, in a liberal democracy to enforce the kind of measures that we've seen in places like China. Are you comfortable with emergency laws that would, for example, force people to stay in their homes?
Yes, I am comfortable because I think it has reached that scale of urgency. Yes, it's frankly, I've got nothing to complain about. I've got fairly mild symptoms which I can perfectly tolerate and treat on my own. And many people will be in that situation. I admit people, living in households, that will be more of an inconvenience for those requiring 14 days of isolation. But I just urge all of them in their moments of understandable frustration to consider the prospect that them not following that advice will mean that more people will die. So far, I understand why the government has used moderate and perhaps euphemistic language of people being taken from us before their time, etc. But the plain fact is, unless people follow this advice to the letter, and without exception, more people will die. And that is the most sobering thought that anyone can have, and should actually allow people to be able to better understand why they're being asked to take these measures.
And we've been told as well that we shouldn't now go to pubs and clubs and restaurants and bars. The government at this point, as we speak, hasn't yet enforced the closure of those venues, though, and there's lots of concern that therefore they can't claim on their insurance. Are you getting sort of worries from local businesses saying we really do need a bit more help from the government?
Understandably. Absolutely. And I think that I would wait for the emergency powers legislation, which I think is being, some of which will be released today and certainly by Thursday for consideration on Monday, I believe. And that will contain details. I suspect part of the reason for that is, and the need for small businesses such as those to claim on their insurance, is I do wonder if behind the scenes there is a package being developed whereby insurance companies will have to be underwritten, given the scale of claim that is to come. And so if it's taking a couple or few days to do that, I understand that. But certainly those businesses do need to be able to claim from their insurance companies. That can only be done when government has told them officially to close up shop. But I suspect the delay is because a package is being worked upon behind the scenes.
So you're sort of hopeful that the government will come out and say we've got a financial package and we can bail out these businesses. I mean, it's going to be an interesting situation, isn't it, for a Conservative government, because ultimately they may have to announce pretty socialist measures here. It might be sort of virtual kind of state control of pretty much everything.
Well, socialist measures maybe, but they could be given that label. But I would hope that we could perhaps see beyond labels at the moment in time. I think there have been Conservative governments that have brought in quite draconian measures in the past. I know a lot of reference has been made to the last World War and so forth, but they're being brought in because they're necessary to deal with a public health problem. I don't think this is a sort of socialism by the back door kind of scenario that we're witnessing at the moment, but rather measures that are being considered and will be taken because of their necessity in terms of public health.
And in terms of your path to power, which we often talk to people about on this podcast, you were a primary school teacher for a while and you've been a school governor too, so you know the education system well. Do you think at this point it would be wise to close schools?
Not immediately. The reason for that is I imagine, not just imagine, I anticipate that what is being developed is a means by which the children of those in essential occupations, whether that's in the healthcare sector, social care, the emergency services, those who work in food production and distribution and so forth, they are still going to require, they can't be at home with their children, which will be an inevitable consequence of closing schools. And so what needs to be developed is a system whereby perhaps a skeleton staff can be maintained and the children of those who cannot be at home because of the nature of the importance of their employment at this time, that those children have got a place to go. And so I suspect, and I say hope, that is what is being worked together behind the scenes. And so I understand the current situation. I know the frustration now, of course, particularly if any teachers are pregnant or if teachers are following quite rightly the advice on 7-day isolation for themselves or 14 days for their households. I understand why schools may well now be struggling to keep open. But we'll see in the emergency powers legislation stuff to do with staff to student ratios and so forth. And all I'd urge at this time is patience, as frustrating as it might be.
Yeah, and there is some frustration out there. I mean, some people have been saying the government's advice has been a little bit on the confusing side. Do you think it's been clear enough that maybe it could have been a bit clearer?
I think it's been clear enough. If you follow precisely the advice on the gov.uk website, it is extremely clear, extremely easy to follow, and I went to that as my first point of call, and I'd urge everybody to do that. I can understand that, for example, at a press conference or even at a statement in a House where 50 odd questions are posed, that there could be a variation between answers, but and a lack of emphasis on certain things. But that comes only naturally. I think, though, the definitive source is for people to consult that gov.uk website.
Okay. And look, at some point, probably not for a long time yet, things will return to some normality, and there are other questions about the way the government operates and what it's doing and what's going on in politics at the moment. And these are issues that you'll be delving into on the PACAC committee.
Absolutely.
As the abbreviation goes. Let's talk about Dominic Cummings for a start, because you're taking some interesting evidence about the way the government sort of runs itself in terms of special advisors. Yeah. What do you make of Dominic Cummings' influence on the government?
Well, I imagine it's quite significant. I don't think anybody would be in that position otherwise, unless it was significant. I think all governments, all prime ministers have had, probably going back to Marcia Williams under Harold Wilson, there's already been some rather powerful figure behind the throne, hasn't there? You can think about Alistair Campbell. I don't remember people having particularly many good words to say about him, but that seems to all been forgotten these days, and so forth. So I think there's always been a role for important role, actually, that always as a conduit between a prime minister and the civil service.
Do you think that he wields too much influence at the moment?
Well, too much. I would hope not, because I think that there is a role for SPADs. They perform an important role, as I say, but it is always, the mantra is never more true now, that advisors advise and ministers decide, and that's a minister that includes the Prime Minister. But I would, for the moment, given the seriousness of the situation that we're in, resist any temptation. And I'd hope that, by and large, in the political fray at the moment, that there's a suspension of certain hostilities, just because I don't think it will do any of us a great service to delve into those too deeply at the moment.
Okay, and let's get back to you being Prime Minister in that case, if we want to move away from some of the more controversial things.
I don't mind, but I'm just saying that, I'm giving, I would hope at this time that we can perhaps move on from some of the personalities involved and recognise that there's a very serious situation, which everybody at Downing Street will be doing their level best by the country, and I want to recognise that first and foremost.
Okay, well, look, if you were Prime Minister and you were in Downing Street, what is the first law that you'd pass, do you think, if you could do anything? I mean, assuming that we're in sort of normal times again now.
Normal times. Well, I have a bit of a hobby horse in that I first sort of fell out with the government whips on this issue, so it's always been a matter quite dear to me. And it is to do with metro mayors. I've never been a great fan of them. I've never felt that they enjoy the acclamation of the public. So I'd pass a law to allow for a referendum should local areas wish to get rid of their mayors.
Okay, interesting.
Well, I should say that I've already had the opportunity to get my own law through Parliament, and that was when I had a private member's bill when I was first elected to Parliament, and that was a justice bill which allowed for a certain amount of evidence to be admitted at the Court of Appeal, which on average, I'm told, since then has meant that 5 people wrongly convicted each year have been released from prison. So I sort of had the experience of getting a law through in the private member's bill. But, you asked me a question on a rather, niche area, and I'll give you that answer.
So you think that potentially they should be abolished? I mean, we've got elections coming up, not this May now, but next year, because they've had to be postponed because of the coronavirus. Yeah. So when you talk about metro mayors, are you talking about sort of all mayors apart from the London mayor?
I believe that people should have structures that govern them by their consent. And I see devolution as the emperor's new clothes of British politics more generally. That if there's a problem, the answer is devolution. Well, is it? the answer is usually in tackling the problem itself, not rejigging certain structures of governance to, for the sake of doing so, merely perhaps showing activity and justifying a department's existence, perhaps. But I think that people should feel a sort of a buy-in to the systems that govern them. And I think metro mayors in England were the prime example of that being absent, frankly. If you consider the fact that historically in the northeast of England they rejected an assembly, in Manchester itself they rejected having an elected mayor, then lo and behold one came along, because sometimes clearly people give the wrong answers, don't they, in referendums, and people don't like that quite often. But I think you have to respect what people give you as an answer, and they deserve the opportunity to have one on this.
Okay, well, look, you wouldn't be having a Metro Mayor around for dinner anytime soon in Downing Street, but if you could have dinner with any former Prime Minister, who would it be? You mentioned some of your favourites earlier, but who, if you could pick one for dinner?
Robert Walpole, the first one, and to my knowledge, longest serving, because all that we deal with today in terms of where does power reside and the power of the executive, it all, by and large, was settled and set in train by him. I think he'd be a fascinating character to meet. He was the consummate politician of his age. Today, he wouldn't last 5 minutes today, given his record and his propensity for giving bribes and taking them, indeed, and so forth. But I think he would be an interesting person to understand, to realise how this role was shaped and how it was set in motion.
Okay, you do love your history. I mean, you did study history, to be fair.
You can, and I'm afraid there's only 5 days rattling around in the flat as well. You do become ever so boring.
Never boring, never boring. Right, you've been released from self-isolation now, imagine, and flights are back up and running. Where would you go on holiday as Prime Minister?
I'd have to do that thing that all Prime Ministers do. First of all, holiday in Britain.
Oh, yeah.
Somewhere, and support our British tourist sector. And if I was doing that, which I generally do, it would be the Lake District. It was somewhere like Ambleside and around about there.
Nice.
But then if I was to be able to afford myself the opportunity to go abroad, whether or not I pay for it, that's an entirely different question, isn't it, for a Prime Minister? But whether or not I'd pay for it, I would go somewhere where there was plenty of sunshine, a nice pool and a beach. I don't particularly care what country that was in, but I'd certainly do that.
Well, maybe you can go to the Caribbean as well. What
would be wrong with that?
Well, nothing wrong with that if it's good enough for Boris Johnson.
Well, the mystique was good enough for Princess Margaret, wasn't it, as I've seen in The Crown this week?
Right, what song would you dance to at party conference if they go ahead?
If I could dance would be the first question. What song would I dance? I really wouldn't. I'd let people decide so that they could enjoy the humiliation, because that's not the sort of thing I do very readily.
There could be a democratic vote or a referendum on which...
Whatever song was chosen, I could assure you it would be utterly awful.
And lastly, what would your Downing Street pet be? What animal? Yeah, pet.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't know. I know what it is. I just couldn't hear you. I'd say that I've got a Springer Spaniel at the moment, Monty, who's 14, so he's getting on a bit. So whether he's going to be around enough to see me into number 10, I don't know. But I'd certainly have a Springer Spaniel.
And if you could
they're great companions.
And just sort of coming back to the topic that dominates all of our lives right now, if you could give any piece of advice to the government about coronavirus or urge them to do anything in relation to this crisis, what would it be?
I think be more explicit. People need to have it told to them how it is. And I know there's a fine line, I understand, between scaring people and giving them the information that they need to have, and to respect that. But I think that people in this country are perfectly capable of dealing with the facts of the matter. And it is quite plain to suggest that unless people follow the advice on self-isolation, even if you think it's just a cough and that disappears, to follow it to the letter, because if they don't, more people will die, more people that they know, they themselves may be perfectly fine with this and they're fairly mild inconvenience, but more people will die, and I think that will be a more difficult thing for them to live with than the inconvenience of being held up for a couple of weeks.
Okay. All right. Will Wragg, thank you. Good advice to end this podcast on. Thanks so much for coming on, Acting Prime Minister.
Cheery,
no, not so cheery, but then these are serious times. And look, we hope that you feel better soon yourself.
Thank you ever so much, Paul. I enjoyed it.
Thanks,
you.
Will. Speak to you soon.
Cheers, Beth. Bye-bye.